Sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is ask for help from a stranger. Sometimes love finds us in the darkest moments when we least expect it. In medieval Norway, Elska removes her silver betrothal collar and stands trembling before Stigandr, the village blacksmith. She whispers, "I took it off." "Please?" The collar means she's engaged to a cruel man against her will. Stigandr is a giant of a man who keeps to himself after losing his family. But when he sees her desperate plea, something changes in his heart. He takes his hammer and smashes the collar on his anvil. The whole village gasps. This one moment will change both their lives forever. But can two broken souls really find healing together in a world that wants to keep them apart? Before we continue this tale, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The mountains of Vagfjell had witnessed countless seasons of human struggle, their snow-capped peaks standing as silent sentinels over the harsh fjordland below. Here, where the North Sea carved deep gouges into the rocky coastline, the village of Skjaldheim clung to existence like barnacles on storm-battered cliffs. The settlement bore the weathered marks of a people who had learned to endure. Wooden buildings with thick stone foundations, reinforced against winter's fury, and narrow streets that channeled the bitter winds away from hearth and home. In this place, where survival demanded both strength and cunning, Elska Thrimsdottir had grown to womanhood, feeling like a stranger in her own skin. At 22 winters, she possessed the kind of quiet beauty that reminded one of still water before a storm, deceptively calm on the surface, with depths that hinted at hidden currents. Her hair fell in waves the color of autumn wheat, and her eyes held the pale blue-gray of morning mist over the fjord. But it was her hands that truly defined her, nimble fingers that could coax magic from wool and thread, creating tapestries that seemed to breathe with life. The weaver's daughter had inherited more than skill from her mother. Astrid, who had passed 3 winters ago after a lingering illness that left the household hollow and grieving. Thrimslager, her father, had never quite recovered from the loss. Once a proud fisherman who commanded respect among his peers, he had slowly retreated into himself, finding solace only in his cups and the false promises of those who claimed to offer easy solutions to life's hardships. It was this vulnerability that had attracted the attention of Jarl Olafur Bloodaxe, a man whose cruelty was matched only by his cunning. The Jarl ruled the coastal settlements with an iron fist wrapped in the velvet glove of tradition and law. When he had approached Thrimslager with an offer of marriage between Elska and his eldest son, Ragnar, it had been framed as an honor, a chance for a simple weaver's family to rise in station and security. Ragnar Olafsson was everything his father had shaped him to be: tall, broad-shouldered, and possessed of the kind of physical presence that commanded attention in any room. At 28, he had already earned a reputation as a skilled warrior and raider, returning from summer expeditions with ships heavy with silver and slaves. Yet beneath his handsome exterior lay a soul twisted by privilege and cruelty. Elska had witnessed glimpses of his true nature during the formal courtship visits. The way his hand lingered too long on serving girls, the casual violence with which he treated those beneath his station, the cold calculation in his eyes when he looked at her as if appraising livestock. The betrothal had been formalized with ancient rites and binding oaths, sealed with the presentation of the silver collar, a piece of exquisite craftsmanship that served as both symbol and shackle. Wrought by the finest smiths in the Jarl's service, it bore intricate knotwork patterns that seemed to flow like water around delicate representations of ravens and wolves. Beautiful as it was, Elska had come to see it as a noose, growing tighter with each passing day as her wedding approached. The collar was to be worn always, marking her as claimed property until the marriage ceremony, when it would be replaced by the iron arm rings of a wife. Custom demanded that only her betrothed or his father could remove it, and to take it off herself would be seen as a grave insult to the Jarl's honor, one that could result in punishment not just for her, but for her entire family. Yet despite the weight of tradition and consequence, Elska had found herself increasingly unable to bear its presence. Sleep brought dreams of suffocation, and waking hours felt like slow drowning in a life that would never truly be her own. She had tried to speak with her father about her fears, but Trimslager seemed unable to see past the material benefits the alliance would bring. The Jarl's protection, the promise of security, the elevation of their family's status. These things mattered more to him than his daughter's trembling hands and haunted eyes. It was on one of these sleepless nights, when the collar felt heavier than iron chains, that Elska had found herself walking the empty streets of Skjaldheim. Her feet had carried her, as if by their own will, to the forge district where the rhythmic ringing of hammer on anvil could be heard even in the deep hours of night. Here stood the workshop of Stigandr Ironskald, known throughout the region as the finest smith in 3 generations. Stigandr's story was one that mothers told their children as both inspiration and warning. Born to a family of renowned craftsmen, he had shown exceptional skill from boyhood, able to work metal with an artistry that bordered on the mystical. His weapons were sought after by jarls and kings, his decorative work commissioned for temples and great halls. But more than his craft, it was his prowess as a warrior that had made him legendary, standing nearly 7 feet in height, with shoulders broad enough to fill a doorway and arms thick as ship's masts. Stigandr had been a formidable presence on any battlefield. His warhammer Skullcrush had become the stuff of saga, its head forged from star metal that fell from the heavens. In his prime, he had served as champion to various lords, his skills in both smithcraft and warfare making him invaluable. But that was before the plague that had swept through the Northlands 5 winters past, claiming not just thousands of lives, but destroying entire bloodlines. Stigandr's wife Inga had been among the first to fall, followed by their 3 young children, Bjorn, Astrid and little Orm, barely walking when the sickness took him. The man who emerged from that season of death was a shadow of his former self, broken in ways that no amount of time seemed able to heal. Since then, Stigandr had withdrawn from the world, accepting only the most essential commissions and speaking to no one unless necessity demanded it. His great hall, once filled with laughter and warmth, stood empty save for the man himself. He worked now not for glory or gold, but simply because the rhythm of hammer and anvil was the only thing that could quiet the voices of the dead that echoed in his mind. The forge itself reflected its master's solitude, a cavernous space lit by the eternal glow of banked coals. Its walls lined with tools that seemed almost religious in their precision and care. The anvil at its center was a massive block of the finest steel, worn smooth by decades of use, while bellows large enough to power a ship's engine ensured that fires could burn hot enough to work even the most stubborn metals. On this particular night, when Elska's wandering had brought her to his threshold, Stigandr was working on a commission that had troubled him for days, a ceremonial sword ordered by Jarl Olafr himself. The blade was to be a gift for his son's upcoming marriage, its pommel decorated with the family's raven crest and its fuller inscribed with binding runes. Each strike of his hammer felt like complicity in chains he could not name, but instinctively despised. The sound of soft footsteps on the threshold made him pause, his weathered face turning toward the doorway, where firelight and shadow painted everything in shades of gold and black. What he saw there, a young woman in a simple woolen dress, silver collar gleaming at her throat, eyes bright with unshed tears, stirred something in him that had lain dormant since his family's death. Elska stood transfixed by the sight before her. The massive smith, his leather apron stretched across a chest like a barrel, seemed carved from the same granite as the mountains themselves. His beard, more silver than black now, was braided with small iron rings that caught the firelight, and his eyes, deep brown like rich earth, held depths of sorrow that spoke to her own pain. For a long moment, neither spoke. The only sounds were the soft hiss of cooling metal and the distant crash of waves against the harbor rocks. Then with trembling fingers, Elska reached up and began to work at the clasp of her collar. The silver was warm from her skin, its intricate patterns having become as familiar as her own heartbeat. But as she lifted it from her throat, she felt something she had not experienced in months, the ability to draw a full breath. The collar seemed impossibly heavy in her hands as she extended it toward the silent smith. "I took it off," she whispered, her voice breaking on the words. "Please." Stigandr stared at the delicate piece of metalwork, understanding immediately what it represented and what her gesture meant. In his hands he held his own hammer, 3 feet of seasoned oak, topped with a head of star iron that had shaped countless weapons and tools. For a heartbeat that stretched into eternity, he weighed the collar's significance against the memory of his own losses, his own chains to a world that had taken everything precious from him. Then, with deliberate precision, he placed the collar on his anvil. The hammer fell with the weight of thunder. The silver collar exploded into fragments under Stigandr's blow, pieces of precious metal scattering across the forge floor like fallen stars. The sound echoed through the night air with such force that it seemed to shake the very foundations of Skjaldheim, reverberating off stone walls and wooden beams until it faded into the darkness beyond. Elska gasped, her hand flying to her throat where the collar had rested for so many months. The skin there felt raw and tender, like a wound finally exposed to healing air. She stared at the scattered pieces of silver, each fragment catching the firelight and throwing it back in tiny, brilliant sparks. "It's done," Stigandr said, his voice rough as grinding stone. He set the hammer aside with careful deliberation, his massive hands surprisingly gentle as he turned to face her. There's no undoing what just happened. The finality of his words hit Elska like cold water. She had acted on impulse, driven by desperation and the crushing weight of a future she could not bear. But now, seeing the irreversible destruction of the Jarl's property, the full magnitude of her choice began to settle in her mind like winter frost. "They'll kill me," she whispered, the words barely audible above the crackling of the forge fire. "When they discover what I've done, they'll kill me, and they'll come for you as well." Stigandr studied her face in the flickering light, noting the way her chin trembled despite her effort to remain strong. She reminded him painfully of his own daughter, Astrid, who had possessed that same mixture of courage and vulnerability. The memory stirred something protective in him that he had thought buried with his family. Perhaps, he acknowledged with the calm acceptance of a man who had already lost everything that mattered. But death holds little fear for one who has watched his children waste away with fever. And some chains are worth breaking regardless of the cost. Outside, the first pale fingers of dawn were beginning to stretch across the sky, painting the eastern mountains in shades of rose and gold. With the coming light would come discovery. Servants who would notice Elska's absence, perhaps even early risers who might have heard the distinctive sound of his hammer's blow. Time was becoming their enemy. "You cannot return home," Stigandr continued, his practical mind already working through the implications. "Your father will have no choice but to deliver you to the Jarl once the collar's absence is discovered. And Ragnar," he paused, having heard enough stories about the Jarl's son to know the young man's nature. "He will not accept this insult lightly." Elska nodded, wrapping her arms around herself as if trying to hold her courage together. She had known this moment would come from the instant she lifted the collar from her throat, but the reality of exile, of leaving behind everything familiar, felt overwhelming. "Where can I go?" she asked. "I have no kin beyond this village, no allies who would risk the Jarl's wrath by sheltering me." Stigandr was quiet for a long moment, staring into the dying embers of his forge fire. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of a decision that would alter both their destinies. "There are places," he said slowly, "hidden valleys in the high mountains where those who flee justice or misfortune can find sanctuary. I know the paths, traveled them in my younger days when I served lords whose enemies made it unwise to remain in civilized lands." He turned from the fire to face her fully, his brown eyes serious and searching. But such journeys are perilous, especially for one unaccustomed to wilderness survival. The mountain passes are treacherous even in fair weather, and winter comes early at those heights. "I'll go alone if I must," Elska said, lifting her chin with a determination that surprised them both. "I won't ask you to abandon your life for a stranger's foolish choice." "My life?" Stigandr's laugh was bitter as old ale. "What life is that? Days spent in solitude, nights haunted by ghosts creating weapons for men I despise." He gestured toward the ceremonial sword he had been working on, Ragnar's wedding gift, now forever unfinished. "Perhaps it's time this old wolf found a different path." The sound of voices in the distance made them both freeze. Somewhere in the village, people were beginning to stir, fishermen preparing for the day's work, farmers heading to tend their animals. Soon, Elska's absence would be noticed, and the search would begin. "We need to leave now," Stigandr said, moving with surprising speed for such a large man. "Gather what you can carry, food, warm clothing, anything that might aid survival in the mountains." "What about you?" Elska asked, watching as he began pulling tools and supplies from various corners of the forge. "I have what I need," he replied, shouldering a pack that had clearly seen much use in years past. His warhammer Skullcrush hung at his side like an old friend returning to familiar duty. The mountains have their own provisions for those who know where to look. As they prepared to leave, Stigandr paused by his anvil, looking down at the scattered fragments of silver. With deliberate care, he began collecting the pieces, wrapping them in a piece of soft leather. "Why?" Elska asked, puzzled by his actions. "Evidence," he said grimly. "Should anyone doubt what transpired here, let them see the Jarl's precious collar reduced to scrap." He tucked the bundle into his pack, then moved toward a heavy wooden chest in the far corner of the forge. From within, he withdrew an object that made Elska catch her breath, a gold arm ring of exquisite craftsmanship, its surface engraved with intricate patterns that seemed to tell stories of ancient heroes and distant lands. The piece was clearly valuable beyond measure, the kind of treasure that represented years of skilled labor. "My masterwork," Stigandr explained, noting her expression. "Created in the early days of my marriage, when skill and joy flowed together in equal measure. I've kept it all these years, unable to sell or trade something that held so much of my heart." He held the arm ring out to her, and Elska stepped back, shaking her head. "I cannot accept such a gift," she protested. Its value lies in its purpose," Stigandr interrupted gently. "Gold can buy passage, provisions, even protection when words fail. Consider it payment for the service you've done me." "What service?" Elska asked, genuinely confused. Stigandr's weathered face softened slightly, and for a moment she glimpsed the man he had been before grief carved its lines into his features. "You've given me a reason to leave this place of ghosts," he said simply. "For 5 years, I've been as dead as those I mourned, going through the motions of living without purpose or hope. Tonight, watching you find the courage to break your chains, something in me remembered what it meant to fight for something worthwhile." The distant voices were growing closer now, and the eastern sky was brightening with each passing moment. Time had become their most precious commodity, slipping away like water through cupped hands. "The mountain path begins just beyond the old watchtower on the northern ridge," Stigandr said, shouldering his pack and checking his weapons. "It's a hard climb, but it will take us above the tree line before full daylight. From there we can see anyone who might follow." Elska nodded, accepting the gold arm ring with trembling hands. Its weight felt strange against her wrist, not the oppressive burden of the silver collar, but the solid reassurance of freedom earned through courage and paid for with risk. As they slipped from the forge into the pre-dawn darkness, neither looked back at the life they were leaving behind. The scattered fragments of silver on the anvil caught the last gleam of dying firelight, bearing silent witness to the moment when 2 broken souls had chosen to forge a new destiny together. Behind them, Skjaldheim slept on, unaware that its most skilled smith and its most reluctant bride had vanished into the mountains, carrying with them the seeds of a legend that would outlive them both. The mountain path proved as treacherous as Stigandr had warned. What had begun as a well-worn track near the village quickly transformed into a narrow ledge carved from living rock, with loose stones that shifted treacherously underfoot and drops that seemed to plunge straight into the heart of the earth. Elska's soft leather shoes, suitable for walking village streets, provided little protection against the sharp stones and thorny undergrowth that tore at her feet with each step. By the time the sun crested the eastern peaks, they had climbed high enough to see Skjaldheim spread below them like a child's toy village. The harbour, where fishing boats bobbed like scattered leaves, looked impossibly small from this height. But it was the activity in the streets that made Elska's stomach clench with fear. Tiny figures, moving with obvious purpose, gathering in groups that could only mean one thing. "They've discovered my absence," she said, breathing hard from the climb. Her woolen dress, practical enough for village life, had not been designed for mountain travel. The heavy fabric caught on every branch and stone, while sweat made it cling uncomfortably to her skin despite the chill mountain air. Stigandr paused to study the scene below, his experienced eyes reading the patterns of movement like a hunter tracking prey. "Aye," he confirmed grimly, "and they'll have found the forge by now as well. Your father will have no choice but to tell them everything he knows." The weight of what she had brought upon her family settled on Elska's shoulders like a stone cloak. Trimslager would face the Jarl's wrath for his daughter's transgression, and there was nothing she could do to protect him from the consequences of her choice. "I should go back," she said suddenly, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "Face whatever punishment they deem fitting. My father doesn't deserve to suffer for my rebellion." Stigandr's large hand closed gently but firmly on her arm, stopping her from turning back down the path. "Your father made his choice when he agreed to sell you to that wolf's whelp," he said, his voice carrying the hard wisdom of years. "And going back now would only ensure that both your sacrifices were meaningless. Ragnar would not be content with simple punishment, not for an insult this public." In the distance, thin columns of smoke began rising from the village, signal fires that would carry news of the night's events to every settlement within a day's ride. The Jarl's network of allies and obligations would soon be activated, turning every farm and fishing village into potential enemies for the fugitives. "We need to keep moving," Stigandr said, shouldering his pack once more. "The higher passes will be our salvation, but only if we reach them before the hunting parties organize." As they climbed, Elska found herself studying her unlikely companion with growing curiosity. The man moved through the treacherous terrain with the confidence of someone who had spent years in wild places, his massive frame surprisingly graceful as he navigated obstacles that left her stumbling. Yet there was more to observe than mere physical competence. When they paused to rest beside a mountain stream, she watched him examine their surroundings with the methodical attention of a craftsman studying his materials. He noted wind patterns, the condition of the stone, the types of plants that grew at this elevation, details that spoke of deep knowledge earned through hard experience. "You've traveled these paths before," she observed, grateful for the chance to rest her aching feet in the cold stream water. "Many times," Stigandr confirmed, filling his waterskin from a spot where the current ran clear and fast. "In my younger days, when I served Lord Eriksson of Nordmark, there were occasions when strategic withdrawal became necessary. These mountains served as both refuge and highway for those who knew their secrets." He handed her his waterskin, noting how she favored her right foot. The soft leather of her shoe had split along one seam, and he could see blood staining the fabric where stones had cut through. "Your feet won't last another day in those," he said bluntly. "We'll need to do something about proper footwear before we go much higher." From his pack, he produced a bundle wrapped in oiled leather. Inside were strips of tough hide, lengths of sinew, and tools for basic leatherworking, supplies that spoke of a man who had learned to be self-sufficient in harsh conditions. "I can fashion something serviceable," he continued, kneeling beside the stream to examine her injured foot, with the same careful attention he brought to examining a flawed piece of metal. It won't be pretty, but it will protect you from the worst of what lies ahead. As he worked, cutting and shaping the leather with practiced skill, Elska found herself thinking about the gold arm ring that now encircled her wrist. The intricate patterns seemed to shift and flow in the changing light, telling stories she couldn't quite decipher, but somehow understood on a deeper level. "The engravings on this piece," she said, running her finger along the detailed metalwork. "They're unlike anything I've seen before. The style, the technique, it's as if the gold itself holds memories." Stigandr's hands paused in their work, and she caught something in his expression, a flicker of old pain mixed with pride. "It was meant to be a wedding gift," he said quietly, returning his attention to the makeshift shoe he was crafting. "For my Inga to mark our 5th year of marriage. I spent months on the design, working only in the early morning hours before the day's commissions claimed my attention." He held up the piece of leather, checking its fit against her foot before continuing his story. "The patterns tell the tale of Freya's necklace, how she earned Brisingamen through sacrifice and determination. I thought it fitting for a woman who had given me more joy than I had believed possible." His voice grew rougher with memory. "I never had the chance to give it to her. The plague came early that spring, and by the time I finished the piece there was no one left to receive it." Elska felt tears prick her eyes at the raw emotion in his words. Here was a man who had poured his heart into creating something beautiful, only to have fate steal away its intended purpose. Yet he had carried it all these years, unable to part with something that represented both love and loss in equal measure. "She would have treasured it," Elska said softly, "and I hope, she would understand why you chose to pass it on. It's too beautiful to remain hidden away, too full of love to serve no purpose." Stigandr finished securing the improvised shoe to her foot, testing the fit with gentle pressure. The leather was rough against her skin, but it provided protection and support that her original footwear had lacked. "There," he said, rising to his full height. "It should serve until we can find something better." As they prepared to resume their climb, the sound of distant horns echoed up from the valleys below, long, mournful calls that spoke of pursuit and determination. The hunt had begun in earnest, and their head start was already shrinking with each passing hour. "How far to the first refuge?" Elska asked, testing her weight on the makeshift shoe. 2 days hard climbing," Stigandr replied, his eyes already scanning the path ahead. "But the route grows more difficult from here. We'll be traveling above the tree line soon, where the air grows thin, and the weather can change without warning." He shouldered his pack and turned to face the steep slope that rose before them like a wall of stone and ice. "Are you ready for this, Elska Thrimsdatter? Because once we commit to this path, there will be no turning back." The second day of their ascent brought weather that seemed determined to test their resolve. What had begun as a clear morning dissolved into a grey shroud of mist and drizzle that turned the rocky path treacherous and reduced visibility to mere arm's lengths. Elska's improvised shoes held together, but the constant moisture made every step a careful negotiation between forward progress and the very real possibility of a fatal fall. By midday, they had reached a sheltered overhang where Stigandr called for a halt. The natural cave was barely large enough for both of them, but it offered protection from the wind that had begun to howl across the exposed mountainside with increasing ferocity. "We'll wait here until the weather clears," he announced, settling his massive frame against the back wall of the shallow cave. "These mountain storms can be deadly to travelers caught in the open." Elska huddled beside him, grateful for both the shelter and the warmth that radiated from his body like heat from a banked forge. Her woolen dress, thoroughly soaked despite her attempts to shield herself from the rain, clung to her skin with clammy persistence. She found herself shivering uncontrollably, her teeth chattering in a rhythm that seemed to echo off the stone walls. Without a word, Stigandr began unpacking items from his travel bundle. From its depths emerged a thick woolen cloak, clearly sized for his broad shoulders, but long enough to wrap around Elska's smaller frame twice over. The fabric smelled of pine smoke and iron, scents that spoke of honest work and practical living. "Here," he said, draping the cloak around her shoulders with surprising gentleness. "Body warmth lost to wet clothing can kill as surely as any blade." As she pulled the cloak tight around herself, Elska caught sight of something that made her breath catch in her throat. Tucked carefully in the inner pocket of Stigandr's pack was a small wooden carving, a child's toy horse, worn smooth by countless small hands. The sight of it struck her with unexpected force, a tangible reminder that this powerful man had once been a father who crafted playthings for his children. "You still carry pieces of them with you," she said softly, not trusting herself to speak louder. Stigandr followed her gaze to the toy, his weathered features shifting through emotions too complex to name. For a moment, the cave was filled only with the sound of wind and rain, punctuated by the distant rumble of thunder rolling across the peaks. "Orm carved that himself," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "He was only 4 winters old, but he had steady hands and a patience unusual for his age. I found it among his things after—" He stopped, swallowing hard. "I couldn't leave it behind." The raw pain in his voice made Elska's heart ache. She understood now why he had withdrawn from the world so completely, why the forge had become both sanctuary and prison. How did one continue living when everything that gave life meaning had been torn away? "Tell me about them," she said gently. "Your family. What were they like?" Stigandr was quiet for so long that she began to think he wouldn't answer. But then, slowly, words began to emerge, hesitant at first, then flowing like water breaking through a dam. "Inga was the wisest woman I ever knew," he began, his eyes distant with memory. "She could look at a person and see straight through to their heart, know their troubles before they spoke a word. Our home was always full of neighbors seeking her counsel, children drawn to her stories, travelers grateful for her hospitality." He picked up the small wooden horse, turning it over in his massive hands with infinite care. "Bjorn was our eldest, 12 winters when the plague took him, strong like his father, but gentle like his mother. He would have made a fine smith given time. Already he could work the bellows and select coal by its burning qualities." Stigandr's voice grew rougher. Astrid had her mother's gift for seeing into people's souls, but she combined it with a fierce independence that sometimes worried us. She was 8, and already declaring she would never marry unless she found a man worthy of her respect. A smile ghosted across his features, bitter and sweet in equal measure. And Orm, little Orm, was pure joy given human form. He laughed at everything, found wonder in the simplest things. A butterfly landing on his hand could occupy him for an hour. He used to sit by my anvil, carving his toys while I worked, both of us content in our separate crafts. The thunder outside grew closer, and lightning began to flicker through the grey afternoon, casting brief, stark shadows across the cave walls. But inside their small shelter, Elska felt a different kind of illumination, the gradual revelation of the man behind the legend. "They sound like people anyone would be blessed to know," she said. "And they were fortunate to have a father who loved them so completely." "Love," Stigandr repeated, as if testing the word's weight. "I thought love was enough to protect them. Thought my strength, my skill, my reputation could shield them from the world's cruelties. But the plague cared nothing for a father's love or a warrior's prowess. It took them as easily as it took the weak and the powerless." His hands closed around the toy horse, knuckles whitening with the force of old grief. "For 5 years, I've told myself their deaths were meaningless, that everything we built together was lost. But watching you last night, seeing you choose courage over safety, I remembered something Inga used to say. She believed that love leaves marks on the world, changes things in ways we can't always see." Elska reached out, her small hand covering his massive one where it gripped the wooden horse. "Perhaps she was right," she said. "Perhaps the love you gave them, the values you taught them, continue to shape the world through the choices you make. through the courage you showed in helping a stranger break her chains. Outside, the storm was beginning to intensify, but neither of them moved to check on conditions beyond their shelter. Something important was happening here in this small cave. Walls built from years of isolation were beginning to crack, allowing light to penetrate darkness that had seemed absolute. "Why did you really help me?" Elska asked, the question that had been forming in her mind since they left the village. "You could have sent me away, refused to get involved. It would have been the safer choice." Stigandr considered this, his thumb tracing the worn surface of his son's carving, "because in that moment, when you stood in my forge, with tears in your eyes and courage in your heart, you reminded me who I used to be, before grief turned me into a ghost haunting my own life." He met her eyes, and she saw depths there she hadn't noticed before. Not just sorrow, but strength that had been buried, not broken, and perhaps because I finally understood what Inga meant about love leaving marks. The love I had for my family, it didn't die with them. It was waiting for someone worthy to receive it. The storm cleared by evening, leaving the mountain air sharp and clean, washed of the summer's dust and heat. As they emerged from their shelter, the peaks around them gleamed like polished silver in the setting sun, and the path ahead, though still treacherous, seemed more manageable in the improved visibility. They had climbed above the tree line now, entering a realm of stone and sky where only the hardiest plants clung to life in the cracks between rocks. The silence here was profound, broken only by the whisper of wind and the distant cry of eagles circling the highest peaks. It was a landscape that spoke of eternity, where human concerns seemed as small and fleeting as mayflies. As they made camp that night in the lee of a great boulder, Stigandr produced another surprise from his seemingly endless supply of practical items, a set of metal hooks and a length of strong cord that he assembled into fishing tackle with practiced efficiency. Mountain streams above the tree line often hold trout, he explained, noting Elska's surprised expression, provided one knows how to read the water and has patience enough to wait for the fish to overcome their wariness. While he worked the pools below a small waterfall, Elska gathered what dry wood she could find and attempted to build a fire using techniques she had observed but never practiced herself. Her efforts produced more smoke than flame, and she found herself growing frustrated with the seemingly simple task. "Here," Stigandr said, returning with 2 gleaming trout and observing her struggles. "Building a proper fire is as much craft as any metalwork. It requires understanding the materials and respecting their nature." He knelt beside her small pile of twigs and showed her how to arrange the wood for proper airflow, how to create a nest of the finest kindling, and how to nurse the first sparks into steady flame. His hands, so powerful when wielding hammer and tongs, displayed remarkable delicacy as they coaxed fire from seemingly reluctant materials. "My father tried to teach me these things," Elska admitted as the flames finally caught and held. "But I was always more interested in my weaving than in learning outdoor skills. I suppose I thought such knowledge would never be necessary for a village girl." "All knowledge proves useful eventually," Stigandr replied, cleaning the fish with swift, efficient movements, "though perhaps not always in ways we expect." As they shared their simple meal, Elska found herself studying the artifact that had become so important to their journey, the gold arm ring that encircled her wrist. In the firelight, the intricate engravings seemed to come alive, the patterns shifting and flowing like living things. "The story you mentioned," she said, turning the arm ring to catch different angles of the light, "about Freya's necklace. I know only fragments of that tale. Would you tell me the complete version?" Stigandr settled back against the boulder, his eyes reflecting the dancing flames as he gathered his thoughts. When he spoke, his voice took on the measured cadence of a storyteller, rich with the rhythm of ancient words passed down through generations. Long ago, when the world was younger and the gods walked more freely among mortals, Freya was already known as the most beautiful of all the divine beings. Her golden hair outshone the sun itself, and her eyes held depths bluer than the summer sky. But beauty, even divine beauty, was not enough for the goddess of love and war. He paused to add wood to the fire, sending sparks spiraling up toward the star-filled sky. One day, while traveling through Alfheim, Freya discovered the workshop of 4 master craftsmen, dwarfs whose skill with precious metals was legendary even among the gods. They were creating something that took her breath away, a necklace of such exquisite beauty that it seemed to capture the very essence of desire itself. Elska leaned forward, drawn into the ancient rhythm of the tale. Around them, the mountains listened with the patience of stone, as if they too were hearing the story for the first time. The necklace was called Brisingamen, and it was wrought from gold that had been kissed by starlight and blessed by the tears of the earth. Each link was a masterwork, flowing together in patterns that spoke of love and loss, passion and sacrifice. When Freya first saw it, she knew she must possess it. Regardless of the cost, the fire crackled and settled, sending new patterns of light across their faces as Stigandr continued. She offered the dwarfs gold, silver, precious gems, treasures beyond mortal comprehension. But the craftsmen were unmoved by material wealth. They had spent years creating this piece, pouring their souls into every detail. They would not part with it for mere riches. Elska touched the arm ring again, understanding now why Stigandr had chosen this particular story to immortalize in gold. The parallel between Freya's desire and her own desperate need for freedom was unmistakable. What did she do? Elska asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. She offered herself, Stigandr said simply. One night with each of the 4 craftsmen, in exchange for the necklace that had captured her heart. Some say it was a shameful bargain, that a goddess should not lower herself to such terms. But I believe Freya understood something that her critics did not. He met Elska's eyes across the fire, his expression serious and thoughtful. True freedom, whether from unwanted obligations or the chains of others' expectations, always requires sacrifice. Freya was willing to pay the price because she understood that some things are worth any cost. The necklace became not just an ornament, but a symbol of her independence, her refusal to let others dictate the terms of her existence. The story hung in the air between them, its implications as clear as the mountain air they breathed. Elska understood that Stigandr was speaking about more than ancient myths. He was talking about choices, about the courage required to break free from circumstances that others found acceptable. "And you believe I've made a similar choice," she said. "It wasn't a question, haven't you?" he asked gently. "You've sacrificed the safety of acceptance, the comfort of familiar surroundings, the approval of your community. In exchange, you've claimed something far more precious, the right to determine your own destiny. Above them, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, the same constellations that had looked down on Freya's struggle and witnessed countless other acts of courage throughout the long history of the world. The mountain peaks stood sentinel around their small camp, their silence somehow approving of the truths being spoken beside the flickering fire. "But the price," Elska whispered, thinking of her father's likely fate, the pursuit that would surely follow them into these heights. "Sometimes I wonder if freedom is worth the cost to others." Stigandr was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands turning the wooden horse over and over as he considered her words. "That question haunted me for years after my family's death," he said finally. "If I had been a different man, made different choices, could I have protected them? Was my pride, my reputation, my refusal to compromise somehow responsible for their fate?" He set the toy aside and looked directly at her, his brown eyes warm with hard-won wisdom. "But in the end, I learned that we cannot live our lives in service to fears of what might happen to others. We can only act with honor, choose with courage, and trust that those who truly love us would rather see us free than safe." The third morning of their journey brought an unwelcome discovery. As Stigandr scouted the path ahead, while Elska broke their camp, he returned with grim news written across his weathered features. "Riders," he said without preamble. "At least a dozen, moving up the lower slopes with purpose. They're following our trail, Elska's hands stilled on the pack she was securing, her heart beginning to race despite her efforts to remain calm. How close? Half a day behind, perhaps less if they pushed their mounts hard. He studied the terrain above them, his experienced eye calculating distances and possibilities. But they'll have to abandon the horses soon. The path ahead is too narrow and steep for mounted pursuit. From his pack, Stigandr withdrew an object that Elska had not seen before. A bronze compass rose, its surface green with age and etched with runes that seemed to shift in the morning light. The artifact was clearly ancient, its craftsmanship speaking of a time when such instruments were made by masters who understood both navigation and magic. "This belonged to my grandfather," he explained, holding the compass flat in his palm and watching as its needle settled on true north. He was a ship's navigator before he became a smith, sailed the whale roads to lands whose names are now forgotten. He always said that knowing your direction was the difference between adventure and disaster. The compass needle quivered slightly, then pointed steadily toward a gap between two towering peaks that seemed impossibly distant. "There's another path," Stigandr continued, his voice taking on the careful tone of a man weighing dangerous options. "A route my grandfather showed me in my youth, when he still possessed the strength for such climbs. It leads through the Serpent's Spine, a ridge so narrow and treacherous that few have ever attempted it." Elska looked toward the peaks he indicated, their snow-covered summits lost in wisps of cloud. The very sight of them made her stomach clench with vertigo. "And you think we can manage what few others have attempted?" "I think we have little choice," Stigandr replied grimly. "The main path leads to the summer pastures, where the Jarl's men will have allies among the herders. But the Serpent's Spine connects to hidden valleys that few know exist, places where we could winter in safety if necessary." As they gathered their belongings and began the steep ascent toward the ridge, Elska found herself thinking about the compass and its long history of guiding travelers through dangerous territories. There was something comforting about carrying an object that had seen so many journeys, weathered so many storms. "Your grandfather," she said as they climbed, grateful for any distraction from the growing exposure and the knowledge of pursuit below. "What was he like?" Stigandr's expression softened as he recalled the old man who had shaped so much of his early understanding of the world. Harold, Starfinder, was a man who believed that every journey taught lessons that couldn't be learned any other way. He had sailed beyond the edge of every map, seen lands where the sun never sets and others where winter lasts for years. But for all his traveling, he claimed the most important discoveries happened inside a person's heart. They paused to rest on a narrow ledge, both breathing hard from the altitude and exertion. Below them, the world had shrunk to patterns of green and grey, with threads of silver marking streams and waterfalls. From this height, even their pursuers would be invisible, lost in the vastness of the landscape. "He taught me that courage isn't the absence of fear," Stigandr continued, checking the compass again to confirm their bearing. "It's the decision to continue despite being afraid. He said a man who feels no fear is either a fool or a liar, but a man who acts in spite of his fear, that man might accomplish something worthy." Elska thought about her own fears as they resumed climbing. Not just the immediate physical dangers, but the deeper uncertainties about what lay ahead. What would become of them if they survived this journey? Could two people so different, thrown together by circumstance, build something lasting from the ashes of their previous lives? The path grew narrower as they approached the Serpent's Spine, until they were traversing ledges barely wide enough for single file, with drops that seemed to fall away into eternity. Here the ancient stone showed marks left by ice and wind over countless centuries, carved into fantastic shapes that resembled sleeping giants or frozen waterfalls. It was on one of these precarious sections that disaster nearly struck. A section of apparently solid rock gave way under Elska's weight, sending her scrambling for purchase as stones cascaded into the void below. For a heart-stopping moment, she hung suspended over emptiness, her fingers clutching desperately at the rough stone edge. Then Stigandr's powerful hand closed around her wrist, hauling her back to safety with a strength that seemed to defy the laws of balance and leverage. She found herself pressed against the cliff face, trembling with reaction and sudden understanding of how close she had come to ending their journey in the most final way possible. "Easy," he murmured, his own breathing somewhat labored from the effort and fear. "You're safe now. The stone here is older, more reliable," but as he spoke, his eyes were fixed on something that made Elska's blood run cold. Where her hand had been grasping for purchase, a smear of blood marked the rock, not from any injury she had sustained, but from a scrape that had opened across Stigandra's palm as he caught her. "You're hurt," she said, reaching for his injured hand despite their precarious position. "It's nothing," he insisted, but she could see that the cut was deeper than he wanted to admit. Carved by a sharp edge of stone during the rescue, from her limited supplies, Elska tore a strip of cloth from her underdress and began wrapping the wound with careful attention. Her hands shook slightly, both from the aftermath of her near fall and from the intimacy of tending to this man who had risked so much for her safety. "Thank you," she said quietly as she worked, "for catching me. For all of this." Stigandr studied her face as she bound his palm, noting the concentration in her expression, the gentle competence of her touch. Something had shifted between them during that moment of crisis, a recognition that their fates were now truly intertwined, that neither could complete this journey without the other. "We take care of each other," he said simply. "That's what people do when they choose to travel the same difficult path." Above them, the serpent's spine stretched on toward its highest point, a narrow bridge of stone suspended between earth and sky. But somehow, the prospect of crossing that treacherous ridge seemed less daunting now. They would face whatever came next together, drawing strength from the bond that had been forged in crisis and tempered by trust. The summit of the serpent's spine revealed a sight that stopped both travelers in their tracks. Spread across the hidden valley below lay the remnants of an ancient settlement, stone foundations overgrown with mountain grass. The skeletal remains of what had once been substantial buildings, and at the center of it all, a structure that defied explanation. Rising from the valley floor like a monument to forgotten gods stood a massive stone circle, its monoliths carved with symbols that seemed to writhe and shift in the afternoon light. Even from their elevated position, the power radiating from that place was palpable, making the hair on their arms rise and the compass in Stigandra's hand spin wildly, before settling on a bearing that pointed directly toward the ancient stones. "What is this place?" Elska whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind that moaned through the peaks around them. Stigandr stared down at the ruins with an expression that mixed wonder with growing unease. "I've heard whispers of such places, settlements that predate even the oldest saga tales. My grandfather spoke of finding them sometimes, hidden in valleys that maps claimed were empty. He called them the Silent Holds, and he warned that they were not abandoned by choice." As they made their careful descent into the valley, the artifacts of the ancient inhabitants became more visible. Scattered among the ruins were objects that gleamed with the dull sheen of precious metals, cups, ornaments, tools, and weapons that appeared untouched by time or weather. It was as if the people had simply vanished in the middle of their daily lives, leaving everything behind. But it was at the stone circle itself that they made the discovery that would change everything. Lying at the base of the central monolith, partially buried beneath centuries of fallen leaves and debris, was an object that made Stigandra's breath catch in his throat. With trembling hands, he brushed away the accumulated earth to reveal a war hammer unlike any he had ever seen. Its head forged from the same star metal as his own weapon, but worked with a skill that transcended mere craftsmanship. The handle was carved from what appeared to be a single piece of ironwood, its surface covered in runes that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. Most remarkable of all, the hammer's head bore an inscription in the ancient tongue, words that Stigandr could barely decipher, but which sent chills down his spine as their meaning became clear. "Soulforge," he read aloud. his voice heavy with disbelief. "The hammer of Wayland the smith." Elska stared at him in confusion. Who was Wayland? Stigandr's hands hovered over the ancient weapon, afraid to touch something that belonged in legend rather than reality. According to the oldest stories, Wayland was the greatest smith who ever lived, not fully human, perhaps not even mortal. They say he could forge items that held pieces of men's souls, weapons that were bonded to their wielders in ways that transcended death itself. He looked up at the carved monoliths surrounding them, understanding dawning in his eyes like a terrible sunrise. This wasn't just a settlement, Elska. This was his forge, his workshop. And if the legends are true... He stopped, the implications too staggering to voice immediately. What legends? She pressed, though part of her already dreaded the answer. Stigandr rose slowly, his gaze moving from the hammer to the stone circle to the ruins beyond. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of a man who had just realized that the world was far stranger and more dangerous than he had ever imagined. They say that Wayland didn't just forge weapons. He forged destinies, that he could see the threads that connect all living things and work them like metal in his forge. The stories claim he created items that would find their way to those who needed them most. Across centuries, if necessary, he pulled his own warhammer from his belt, comparing it to the ancient weapon before them. The similarities were unmistakable. The star metal composition, the balance, even some of the runic inscriptions. But where his weapon showed the honest wear of use, Soulforge appeared as pristine as the day it was made. "Your hammer," Elska said, understanding beginning to dawn. "It's not just any weapon, is it? I inherited it from my father, who received it from his father before him. Our family has carried Skullcrush for 5 generations, but we never knew." He stopped, reaching into his pack to withdraw the leather-wrapped fragments of Elska's silver collar. As the broken pieces caught the light, something extraordinary happened. The metal began to move, flowing like quicksilver, as it reformed itself into something entirely new. The silver collar was gone, transformed into a bracelet of exquisite beauty, its surface now bearing runes that matched those on both hammers. Elska gasped, instinctively reaching for the transformed silver. The moment her fingers touched the reformed metal, visions flooded her mind, images of Wayland's forge in its prime, of the ancient smith working with cosmic forces beyond human understanding, and most shocking of all, glimpses of her own life and Stigandr's, stretching back through generations. "We're connected," she breathed, the truth hitting her like a physical blow. Not by chance, not by coincidence. This was all arranged somehow, planned across centuries. Stigandr stared at the hammer Soulforge, then at his own weapon, understanding the magnitude of what they had discovered. The bloodlines, my family's connection to this place, your family's gift for working with threads and patterns, were descendants of those who served here. The bronze compass in his pack began to hum with energy, its needle spinning wildly before pointing steadily toward the reformed silver bracelet, now encircling Elska's wrist. Around them the stone monoliths seemed to pulse with renewed life, as if awakening from a sleep that had lasted centuries. "But why now?" Elska asked, though even as she spoke, part of her already knew the answer. "Why have we been brought here at this moment?" Before Stigandr could respond, a new sound reached them from the valley's entrance, the clatter of hooves on stone, the jingle of mail and weapons. Their pursuers had found them, drawn perhaps by the same forces that had guided Elska and Stigandr to this place. But as the first riders appeared at the valley's mouth, both fugitives realized that something fundamental had changed. The artifacts they carried, the reformed silver bracelet, the ancient hammers, the spinning compass, were no longer just tools or symbols. They had become conduits for power that stretched back to the foundation of the world itself. Ragnar Olafsson rode at the head of the pursuing party, his handsome face twisted with rage and wounded pride. Behind him came a dozen of his father's best warriors, men who had never failed to bring back their quarry. But as they entered the valley of the silent hold, their horses began to prance nervously, sensing energies that human understanding could not grasp. "So," Ragnar called out, his voice echoing off the ancient stones. The weaver's brat and the broken smith thought to hide among ruins and legends. How fitting that your rebellion should end in a place of the dead. But Stigandr no longer looked like a broken man. Standing beside the monoliths of his ancestors, with Soulforge gleaming in his grasp, he appeared transformed, not just by the discovery of his heritage, but by the awakening of purposes that had lain dormant for generations. This is not a place of the dead. Boy, he said, his voice carrying across the valley with unexpected authority. This is a place of making, of forging, of creating things that last beyond the span of mortal years. He raised Soulforge, and the ancient weapon caught the light in ways that defied natural law, sending beams of radiance across the stone circle like captured lightning. And you have brought iron into a sacred forge uninvited. That, Stigandr continued, his eyes beginning to glow with the same inner fire that lit the hammer's runes, is a mistake that will cost you dearly. The confrontation in the Valley of the Silent Hold was unlike anything the pursuing warriors had expected. What should have been a simple matter of subduing two fugitives had transformed into something that defied their understanding of the natural world. The very air seemed to thrum with power, and their horses, battle-tested animals that had charged into countless fights, refused to advance beyond the outer ring of ancient stones. Ragnar dismounted with practiced grace, his hand moving instinctively to the sword at his hip. The weapon was a masterwork of conventional smithing, its blade sharp enough to split silk and strong enough to cleave through mail. But as he drew it in the presence of the ancient forge, the steel seemed dull and lifeless compared to the radiance emanating from Soulforge. Magic tricks and old stories won't save you. Smith, Ragnar snarled, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. You've stolen what belongs to me, and I'll have it back along with your heads. Around him, his warriors spread out in a practiced formation, but their movements were hesitant, uncertain. These were men who understood the clash of steel on steel, the honest brutality of blade against shield. The mystical energies swirling through the valley left them feeling like children, stumbling through a forest filled with wolves. Stigandr stepped forward. Soulforge held at the ready, but his posture was that of a craftsman rather than a warrior. There was no aggression in his stance, only the calm certainty of a man who finally understood his purpose. She was never yours to claim. Ragnar Olafsson, he said, his voice carrying with supernatural clarity. No more than the wind belongs to the man who feels it on his face, or the sea to the ship that sails upon it. Elska moved to stand beside him, and as she did, the silver bracelet on her wrist began to pulse with gentle light. The reformed metal had bonded with her in ways she was only beginning to understand, connecting her consciousness to the ancient patterns that governed the workings of fate itself. Through this connection, she could see threads of possibility stretching out from this moment, some leading to victory, others to defeat, many to outcomes that defied simple categorization. But all of them, every possible future, hinged on choices that had not yet been made. There's another way, she said, her voice pitched to carry to both sides of the impending conflict. It doesn't have to end in bloodshed. Ragnar laughed, the sound harsh and mocking in the sacred space. The only way this ends is with you in chains, and him in the ground. My father's honor demands it, and my pride will accept nothing less. But even as he spoke, doubt crept into his voice. The tales of Wayland's Forge were known to every child in the Northlands, stories told around winter fires of a time when gods and mortals walked together. Standing here among the proof of those legends, even his arrogance wavered. It was then that Elska made a decision that surprised them all. Instead of retreating behind Stigandr's protection, she stepped forward toward Ragnar, her hands empty of weapons, but radiating a confidence that seemed to grow with each step. You speak of honor and pride, she said, her voice gentle but unwavering. But what honor is there in forcing chains upon someone who has done you no wrong? What pride can be found in claiming victory over those who seek only freedom? The silver bracelet's light intensified as she spoke, and those ancient symbols carved into the monoliths began to glow in response. The stone circle was awakening fully now, responding to the presence of those whose bloodlines connected them to its original purpose. Ragnar's warriors shifted nervously, some taking involuntary steps backward as the mystical energies in the valley continued to build. These were practical men who understood the physical world, but they were seeing the boundaries of that world bend and stretch in ways that challenged their fundamental assumptions about reality. "You would lecture me about honor?" Ragnar demanded, though his sword hand trembled slightly as supernatural forces pressed against his consciousness. "You who broke sacred oaths and fled like a thief in the night." "I broke chains that should never have been forged," Elska replied, moving closer still. "And I chose freedom over safety, truth over convenience. If that makes me a thief, then I steal only what was mine by right of birth, the ability to choose my own path." Behind her, Stigandr watched with growing admiration as this young woman faced down armed warriors with nothing but courage and wisdom. The silver bracelet was clearly enhancing her natural abilities, allowing her to speak with the authority of ancient truths. But the core strength came from within herself. From his pack he withdrew the bronze compass, noting how its needle now pointed not toward magnetic north, but toward something far more significant. The moral center of the conflict taking place before him. The ancient navigation tool had become a guide for more than mere geography. It was showing the way toward resolution that honored the deepest principles of right and wrong. "Your father sent you to retrieve property," Stigandr said, his own voice taking on the resonance of prophecy. "But property does not weep when caged, does not dream of freedom, does not choose courage over comfort. You pursue not a runaway possession, but a woman whose spirit your family sought to break." He raised Soulforge higher, and the hammer's star-metal head began to sing with harmonics that seemed to resonate in the very bones of those present. The sound was not threatening, but rather transformative, calling forth the best possibilities in every soul within the valley. "And you," Stigandr continued, his gaze fixed on Ragnar with unwavering intensity, "who have the chance to prove yourself greater than your father's ambitions. To choose honor over pride, wisdom over force." For a moment that stretched like eternity, the valley held its breath. The pursuing warriors stood frozen, caught between duty to their lord and growing awareness that they had stepped into something far greater than a simple chase. Their horses whinnied softly, sensing the crossroads of destiny that swirled around them like invisible currents. Ragnar's face cycled through emotions: rage, uncertainty, calculation, and something that might have been the first stirring of actual thought rather than mere reaction. His grip on his sword loosened slightly as he stared at the woman he had come to claim, seeing her perhaps for the first time as something more than an object to be possessed. "The old ways are ending," Elska said, her voice carrying the weight of inevitable change. "The time when women could be traded like cattle, when strength alone determined right, when fear governed choices, that age is passing. You can be part of what comes next, or you can cling to what is already dying." The silver bracelet pulsed again, and suddenly everyone present could see what she saw: threads of possibility spreading out from this moment, showing potential futures where wisdom triumphed over force, where different choices led to different worlds. In one thread, Ragnar pressed his attack and achieved victory through violence, but the taste of it turned to ashes in his mouth as he realized he had won nothing worth having. In another, he retreated in anger and spent years consumed by rage that poisoned every aspect of his life. But there were other possibilities, brighter paths that required only the courage to step away from the familiar patterns of domination and control. "What would you have me do?" Ragnar asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Return to my father empty-handed? Face his wrath and the mockery of those who will say I was bested by a smith and a weaver's daughter? Return with a greater prize than you came seeking," Stigandr suggested, lowering Soulforge, but keeping his grip firm. "Return with the knowledge that you chose wisdom over violence, that you proved yourself capable of growth beyond your father's expectations. The wooden toy horse in Stigandr's pack grew warm against the leather, as if responding to the possibility of new life emerging from old patterns of death and loss. The bronze compass needle steadied on a bearing that pointed toward hope rather than mere survival. Around them, the stone monoliths continued their gentle glow, bearing witness to a moment that would be remembered long after all the participants had passed into legend. The ancient forge was awakening not to create weapons of war, but to forge something far more precious, the possibility of transformation, of choosing a different path than the one dictated by tradition and expectation. The choice hung in the air like morning mist, waiting to be shaped by decisions that would echo through generations yet unborn. The silence that followed Elska's challenge stretched across the valley like a held breath. In that crystalline moment, suspended between violence and wisdom, the ancient stones seemed to lean inward, as if the very foundations of the earth were waiting to see which path would be chosen. Ragnar's sword trembled in his grip, not from fear, but from the weight of a decision that would define not just this encounter, but the man he would become. His warriors watched their young lord with growing tension, hands hovering near their own weapons, uncertain whether to prepare for battle or retreat. Then, with deliberate slowness, Ragnar sheathed his blade. The sound of steel sliding into leather seemed to echo through the valley with the finality of thunder. Several of his men gasped audibly, unable to believe their eyes. This was not the Ragnar they knew, the proud, quick-tempered son who had never backed down from any challenge, who would rather die than appear weak before his enemies. "You speak of choices," Ragnar said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was attempting. "Very well. I choose to hear what you would propose instead of taking what I came to claim." Stigandr felt something shift in the mystical energies surrounding them. Solforge's singing changed pitch, becoming less a call to battle and more a harmony of possibility. The ancient hammer recognized the moment when violence transformed into negotiation, when the tools of war could be set aside in favor of the implements of peace. Elska stepped closer to Ragnar, noting how the silver bracelet's glow softened to match the change in his demeanor. Through her enhanced perception, she could see the threads of fate realigning themselves, dark possibilities fading while brighter paths strengthened and multiplied. "What I propose," she said carefully, "is that you return to your father with a story worth telling, not of conquest but of wisdom, not of forcing chains upon the unwilling, but of choosing to honor the freedom that makes love possible." She gestured toward the ancient stone circle around them, its monoliths still pulsing with gentle light. This place has stood for centuries, watching the rise and fall of kingdoms, the birth and death of empires. What survives from those ages? Not the names of conquerors or the tallies of their victories, but the stories of those who chose compassion over cruelty, wisdom over strength. Ragnar's gaze moved from Elska to Stigandr, then to the mystical artifacts that had transformed this simple pursuit into something approaching the sacred. When he spoke again, there was something different in his voice, a thoughtfulness that had never been there before. "And what of my father's honor? What of the contracts and obligations that bind our families together? Honor that requires the breaking of another's spirit is no honor at all," Stigandr replied, though his tone was not accusatory but explanatory. "True strength lies in protecting those who cannot protect themselves, not in chaining those who seek only freedom." The bronze compass in Stigandr's pack grew warm against the leather, its needle pointing steadily toward the moral center of their discussion. Around them, the ancient stones continued their gentle luminescence, bearing witness to a transformation that none of them had anticipated when this chase began. One of Ragnar's warriors, a grizzled veteran named Thorvald, stepped forward hesitantly. "My lord," he said, his voice respectful but troubled, "your father expects us to return with the girl." "How do we explain?" "We explain the truth," Ragnar interrupted, "and for the first time since entering the valley." His voice carried the authority of a man who had found his own path, rather than following another's. that we discovered something more valuable than compliance with an unjust demand. He turned back to Elska, studying her face with eyes that seemed to truly see her for the first time. "You were right about one thing," he admitted. "The old ways are ending. Perhaps it's time to discover what the new ways might look like." The admission cost him something. Years of certainty. The comfortable assumption that might made right. The simple clarity of never questioning what he had been taught. But in exchange, he gained something far more precious. The possibility of becoming a man his future children could respect rather than merely fear. Elska felt tears prick her eyes as she recognized the courage it took for him to speak those words. Through the silver bracelet's enhanced perception, she could see the golden threads of possibility multiplying around them, showing futures where this moment of wisdom rippled outward through generations. "Then let us forge something new together," she said, extending her hand toward him in a gesture of equals rather than captor and captive. "Not chains that bind, but connections that honor the freedom of all they touch." Ragnar stared at her outstretched hand for a long moment, understanding that accepting it would mean abandoning everything he had been raised to believe about power, possession, and the relationships between men and women. Then, with the same deliberate ceremony with which he had sheathed his sword, he reached out and clasped her hand in his own. The moment their hands touched, the entire valley erupted in light. The ancient stone circle blazed with radiance that seemed to come from within the very atoms of the rock itself, while the artifacts carried by both parties resonated in harmony that transcended the merely physical. Solforge sang with the voice of creation itself, its star metal head throwing off sparks that danced in the air like living constellation. The silver bracelet on Elska's wrist flowed like liquid fire, its reformed patterns telling stories of bonds freely chosen rather than forcibly imposed. But most remarkable of all was what happened to the people. Within that circle of light, Ragnar gasped as visions flooded his consciousness, not the threatening images of conquest and domination that had shaped his upbringing, but glimpses of what his life could become if he chose a different path. He saw himself as a leader who inspired loyalty through wisdom rather than fear, a man whose strength protected the vulnerable rather than exploiting them. In these visions, he found love that was freely given rather than purchased through political arrangement. Children who respected rather than merely obeyed him. His warriors experienced their own transformations, seeing themselves not as instruments of another's will, but as guardians of something greater than any individual ambition. The mystical energies flowing through the valley showed them possibilities they had never dared imagine, lives lived in service to justice rather than mere power. Elska felt the threads of fate weaving themselves into new patterns around her, creating tapestries of possibility that honored both individual freedom and collective harmony. Through the silver bracelet's connection to the ancient forces, she could see how this moment would ripple outward through time, touching lives not yet born, and changing the course of history in ways both subtle and profound. Stigandr stood at the center of it all, Solforge raised high as the conduit through which these transformative energies flowed. For the first time since his family's death, he felt truly alive, not just surviving from day to day, but participating in something that gave meaning to both loss and hope. "Do you see?" he called out, his voice carrying over the harmony of awakened artifacts. This is what the ancient smiths understood, that the greatest creations are not weapons or ornaments, but the bonds between souls who choose to honor each other's freedom. The light began to coalesce around the handshake between Elska and Ragnar, forming something new in the space between their joined palms. It was not visible gold or silver, but something far more precious, a covenant forged from mutual respect and sealed by wisdom earned through trial. When the radiance finally faded, they found themselves changed in ways that went beyond the merely physical. Ragnar's face showed lines of character that had not been there before, the kind of weathering that comes from accepting responsibility for one's choices rather than simply following orders. His warriors stood straighter, their eyes holding depth that spoke of men who had discovered purposes worth serving. Elska's transformation was more subtle, but no less profound. The frightened girl who had fled her father's house had become a woman who understood her own power, not the kind that dominated others, but the strength that came from honoring one's own truth while respecting the rights of others to do the same. "The covenant is sealed," Stigandr announced, lowering Soulforge with ceremonial gravity. Not through conquest or submission, but through the recognition that freedom shared multiplies rather than diminishes. Ragnar released Elska's hand, but the connection forged between them remained, not romantic love, but something equally valuable, mutual respect between equals who had chosen wisdom over tradition. "I will return to my father," he said, his voice carrying new authority, "but not as a failed hunter returning empty-handed. I will go as a man who discovered something more valuable than what he was sent to retrieve." He turned to address his warriors, and they saw in his bearing the emergence of a leader worthy of their loyalty. "We came here seeking to reclaim stolen property," he continued. "Instead, we have witnessed the birth of new possibilities. The stories we tell of this day will inspire rather than merely intimidate." Thorvald, the grizzled veteran, stepped forward with something approaching reverence. "My lord," he said, "what would you have us tell the Jarl? How do we explain what transpired here?" Ragnar smiled, and for the first time it was an expression free of cruelty or calculation. "We tell him the truth, Thorvald, that his son learned the difference between strength and wisdom, between taking what one wants and earning what one deserves." The ancient stone circle began to dim as the mystical energies settled back into dormancy, their purpose fulfilled. But the artifacts carried by the participants continued to glow softly, marking them as bearers of transformation rather than mere tools of war or ornament. As the supernatural light faded into the natural illumination of late afternoon, the Valley of the Silent Hold returned to its eternal silence. But it was no longer the quiet of abandonment. It had become the peaceful rest of a sacred duty completed, a forge that had created its greatest masterwork in the bonds of understanding between former enemies. The covenant forged in that ancient place would endure long after its makers had passed into legend, proving that some creations transcend the materials from which they are made. 3 seasons later, the village of Skjaldheim hummed with changes that no one could have anticipated when Elska first fled into the mountains. The transformation had begun subtly, a new approach to resolving disputes, a different way of arranging marriages that honored the wishes of both parties, a growing recognition that wisdom often mattered more than mere strength. At the center of these changes stood an unlikely partnership. Ragnar Olafsson, now recognized as his father's heir not through birthright alone but through demonstrated wisdom, had become an advocate for what the people were calling the new ways. His first act upon returning from the Valley of the Silent Hold had been to dissolve all existing betrothal contracts that lacked the full consent of both parties. A decision that had cost him considerable political capital, but earned him something far more valuable, the genuine respect of those he would one day lead. Jarl Olafur himself had struggled with his son's transformation, torn between pride in Ragnar's emerging wisdom and frustration with the disruption of carefully laid political plans. But even the old Jarl could not argue with the results. Villages throughout their territory were experiencing unprecedented prosperity as people worked with renewed purpose, knowing their efforts served leaders who valued justice over mere power. The Forge district of Skjaldheim had become a pilgrimage destination of sorts, drawing smiths and craftsmen from distant settlements who came seeking to learn from the legendary Stigandr Ironskald. But those who arrived expecting to find techniques for creating superior weapons were often surprised to discover lessons about forging connections between people instead. Stigandr, had returned to his craft with renewed purpose. But his work had evolved beyond the merely practical. His latest creations, tools, ornaments, and ceremonial pieces, carried something that had been missing from his earlier work. They seemed to hold echoes of the transformation he had experienced in the ancient valley, inspiring those who used them to reach for their highest potential rather than merely their most immediate desires. On this particular morning, as autumn painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Stigandr stood at his anvil working on a commission that held special significance. Before him lay the components of a wedding set, matching arm rings that would symbolize a union based on choice rather than obligation. The bride-to-be was Astrid Eriksdottir, a young woman whose parents had initially arranged her betrothal to a jarl's son from a neighboring territory. But inspired by the stories spreading throughout the region about the events at the Silent Hold, she had found the courage to speak her own preferences. Her chosen partner was Bjorn the Skald, a man whose skill with words had won her heart more surely than any warrior's prowess with sword and shield. As Stigandr shaped the precious metal, he thought about the changes that had transformed not just the village, but his own understanding of what it meant to be a craftsman. The artifacts that had awakened in the ancient valley, Soul Forge, the silver bracelet, the bronze compass, even little Orm's wooden horse, had taught him that the greatest creations were those that honored the freedom and dignity of those who would use them. The workshop door opened, admitting a figure that brought warmth to even the coldest day. Elska entered carrying a basket of bread still warm from the ovens, her presence transforming the practical space into something approaching sacred. The silver bracelet still graced her wrist, though its mystical glow had settled into something more subtle, a gentle reminder of possibilities rather than an active force for transformation. "The morning's baking is finished," she announced, setting the basket on a workbench where its contents would be safe from flying sparks. "And Ragnar sends word that he'd like to discuss the harvest festival arrangements when you have time." Their relationship had evolved into something that defied easy categorization. Not quite romantic love in the conventional sense, but a partnership forged through shared trials and sealed by mutual respect. They had chosen to build a life together based on complementary strengths rather than traditional roles, with Elska's skills as a weaver finding new expression in helping to mend the social fabric of their community. "He still seeks your counsel more than mine," Stigandr observed with gentle humor. Perhaps the true transformation in that valley was not mystical but practical, the discovery that wisdom often comes from unexpected sources. Elska moved to stand beside him at the anvil, watching as he made the final adjustments to the wedding rings. The work was exquisite, but what made it truly special was the intention behind each hammer blow, the understanding that these symbols would represent freedom freely given rather than obligation imposed. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked quietly. "The choice to leave everything behind for an uncertain future?" Stigandr set down his hammer and turned to face her fully, his weathered features soft with contentment that had seemed impossible during his years of solitude. "Every morning when I wake beside you, every evening when we share our thoughts about the day's work, every time I see how our choices have inspired others to choose courage over convenience, how could I regret the path that led to such gifts?" From his pocket, he withdrew the small wooden horse that had traveled with them through the mountains, its surface now worn smooth by countless gentle touches. The toy no longer represented loss and grief, but had become a symbol of continuity, the understanding that love, once given, continues to shape the world, even after its original recipients have passed beyond reach. "Besides," he added with a smile that transformed his entire face, "I suspect our story is far from finished. The artifacts we carry, the bonds we've forged, the changes we've helped bring about, these are just the beginning of something larger. Outside, the sounds of the village carried on the autumn air, children playing, merchants negotiating, craftsmen pursuing their trades. But underneath these familiar rhythms was something new, the harmony of a community, learning to honor both individual freedom and collective responsibility. The covenant forged in the Valley of the Silent Hold had taken root and grown, proving that even the most deeply entrenched traditions could evolve when people found the courage to choose wisdom over force, love over possession, and hope over fear.